The morning light came in sideways through the kitchen window the way it always did in late October, cutting across the linoleum floor in long, pale strips that Ruth Calloway had been watching for 38 years. She stood at the counter in her house dress and slippers, one hand braced against the edge of the sink, the other wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Outside the oak tree her late husband Gerald had planted the year they moved in was dropping its last leaves, slow and reluctant, the way everything in Calhoun, Tennessee seemed to do things. Slow, reluctant, stubborn against the inevitable. Ruth was 74 years old. She had the kind of face that told you everything about the life she had lived. The deep creases around her eyes from decades of squinting into operating room lights. The set of her jaw that nurses develop when they have seen too much death to be rattled by ordinary hardship. The white hair she kept pinned back in a practical bun that she had never once considered dyeing. She was 5'2" on a good day, 138 pounds, and she had not been afraid of a single thing in this world since the winter of 1987, when she had held the hand of a young man dying of complications no one could stop, and decided then and there that fear was a luxury she could not afford. She had buried Gerald 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. They had not had children of their own, though they had tried in the early years. What they had instead was this house, this land, this small patch of eastern Tennessee that Gerald's grandfather had farmed, and that Gerald himself had worked every morning before his post office route and every evening after, right up until his hands stopped cooperating. 3 acres of gently sloping land at the end of Mercer Road, with a creek running along the back property line, and a vegetable garden that Ruth still kept going, smaller than it used to be, but still producing more tomatoes than one woman could reasonably eat alone. The envelope on the table was the 3rd one this month. Ruth had not opened it yet. She knew what was inside because she had opened the first 2, and they had said the same thing in slightly different language. The language of lawyers and bureaucrats and men who had learned to dress cruelty in professional clothing. The Calhoun County Development Authority, in conjunction with the office of Councilman Raymond Foster, was pleased to inform her that the assessed value of her property at 4412 Mercer Road had been updated. She was encouraged to contact the authority at her earliest convenience to discuss options regarding the parcel. Options. That was what they called it. Options. Ruth set down the cold coffee and picked up the envelope. She slid her finger under the flap, not hurrying. She had learned long ago that bad news did not get better or worse based on how quickly you read it. The letter inside was on official county letterhead, crisp and cream-colored, the kind of paper that announced itself as important. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly, the way she had always read important documents, as if hearing the words out loud in her own head gave her better traction on their meaning. The county had revised the assessed value upward again, this time by 42%. Her property tax obligation for the coming year had been recalculated accordingly. The new annual figure was listed at the bottom of the page in bold print, and when Ruth saw it, she set the letter down very carefully on the kitchen table, smoothed it flat with both palms, and stood there looking at it for a long moment. It was nearly 4 times what she had paid last year. It was more than her entire monthly Social Security check. It was, she understood, in the particular way that people who have spent their lives doing arithmetic in their heads understand things, not survivable. Not on what she had, not on what Gerald had left her, which had been love and loyalty, and a house that was paid off, and a small savings account that was dwindling with every year that inflation outpaced her fixed income. She folded the letter back into its envelope, tucked it under the first 2, and went to get dressed. She had an appointment at the county office at 10 o'clock. She had made it herself 3 days ago after reading the second letter. She had called the number at the bottom of the page and spoken to a young woman who had been polite in the way that people are polite when they are following a script that does not include the possibility of your problem being solved. Ellie Marsh picked her up at 9:30 in the old Subaru that smelled permanently of the dried herbs Ellie kept in the back seat. Eleanor Marsh was 64 years old, Ruth's closest friend for the better part of 2 decades, the owner of Marsh's General Store on the main street of Calhoun, a woman who had survived a bad first marriage, a flood that took out her entire ground floor inventory, and the death of her youngest son, and who had emerged from all of it with the particular unbreakable quality of someone who has been tested past what should be survivable. She was taller than Ruth, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, and a directness of speech that some people found abrasive, and Ruth had always found refreshing. "You eat breakfast?" Ellie asked, pulling out of the driveway. "I had coffee." "That's not breakfast, Ruth." "I'm 74 years old, Ellie. I get to decide what breakfast is." Ellie snorted but did not argue. She drove the 12 miles into town the way she always drove, slightly too fast, on the straight stretches with her left elbow propped on the window ledge and her right hand at the bottom of the wheel. The hills were full of color, the last of it before November stripped everything bare, and Ruth watched it out the window and tried not to think about the letter. "What do you know about Derek Foster?" Ruth asked somewhere around mile 7. Ellie was quiet for a beat. "Ray Foster's boy. Works in the county development office. Handles acquisitions." She paused. "Why? He's been the one sending the letters." Another pause, longer this time. "How many letters, Dot?" "3. Each one with a higher tax assessment than the last." "That's not how assessments work, Ruth. They don't revise them 3 times in a single season." "I know that. So they're manufacturing it." "That's what I intend to find out." The Calhoun County Administrative Building was a squat brick structure on the corner of Main and 2nd that had been built in the early 70s and had never been updated, which gave it a particular air of governmental permanence that Ruth suspected was entirely deliberate. The waiting area was beige with plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting, and at 9:58 in the morning, it held 4 other people, all of them looking at their phones, none of them looking at each other. Ruth walked to the reception window and gave her name. The young woman behind the glass checked her computer and told her that Mr. Foster would be with her shortly. Ruth took a seat with her purse in her lap and her 3 envelopes folded inside it, and waited with the stillness of someone who has spent decades waiting in rooms where the news was not going to be good. Derek Foster came out at 10:17. He was 46 years old, thick through the middle, with his father's heavy jaw and his father's small eyes, and the kind of suit that was expensive enough to signal ambition, but not expensive enough to signal that the ambition had been rewarded. He had a smile that reached approximately nowhere near his eyes, and a handshake that was slightly too firm, the handshake of a man who had learned at some point that dominance could be communicated through grip pressure. "Mrs. Calloway," he gestured toward a door behind the reception area. "Come on back." His office was small and neat and had one window that looked onto the parking lot. Ruth sat in the chair across from his desk and placed her purse on her knees and waited while he settled himself behind the desk with the practiced self-importance of a man who was the largest fish in a very small pond. "I appreciate you coming in," he said in the tone of a man who did not appreciate it at all. "I know the recent reassessment came as a surprise." "It came as several surprises," Ruth said. 3 of them in the past 6 weeks. Derek smiled. "The county has been engaged in a comprehensive review of property values throughout the Mercer Road corridor. The real estate market in this area has experienced significant appreciation, and the assessments need to reflect current market conditions." "My property has been in the same family for over 60 years, Ruth said. "Nothing about it has changed." "The surrounding market has changed, Mrs. Calloway. That's outside our control." Ruth took the 3 envelopes from her purse, unfolded them, and laid them on the desk in front of him, side by side, the new tax figures facing up. "My annual obligation last year was $940, she said. "This letter is billing me for $3,800. For the same property, in the same condition, on the same road, in the same county, in 6 weeks." Derek looked at the letters without touching them. As I said, the market, Mr. Foster. Ruth's voice was quiet and precise, the voice she had used for 30 years when a patient was about to do something that was going to hurt them. I worked as a registered nurse for 31 years. I am not unintelligent. I understand what is happening here. What I am asking you is to explain it to me directly, without the language about market conditions. Something shifted in Derek Foster's eyes. The professional pleasantness thinned, and underneath it was something harder, something that had been waiting. He leaned forward slightly in his chair and folded his hands on the desk. Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to be candid with you, because I think you're the kind of woman who prefers candor. He said the word like a gift he was presenting to her. The county has received several significant development proposals for the Mercer Road area. Good proposals, the kind that bring jobs and tax revenue and infrastructure investment, the kind that lift up the whole community. But for those projects to move forward, the parcels in that corridor need to be consolidated. And your property is currently the last unresolved parcel. My property is not a parcel, Ruth said. It is my home. Of course. And we respect that, which is why we've made sure the assessment reflects what the market would pay you for it. If you were to sell at fair market value, I am not selling my home. The pleasantness in Derek's face completed its disappearance. Mrs. Calloway, I want to be helpful here, but the tax obligation is established by the assessment, and the assessment is established by county ordinance. If the obligation isn't met by the 1st of February, the county is legally entitled to place a lien on the property. I'm trying to give you options before that becomes necessary. Options. Ruth said the word, landing flat and cold between them. Options. Derek picked up a folder from the corner of his desk and slid it across to her. Inside was a purchase offer. Ruth saw the number at the bottom before she closed it. It was insultingly low. It was the kind of number that said, "We know you are desperate and we are counting on it." Ruth stood up. She picked up her 3 letters and put them back in her purse. She picked up the purchase offer and set it back on his desk. I will be consulting with an attorney, she said. She turned to leave, and Derek Foster rose from his chair. He moved around the desk faster than she had expected, and when he reached out and put his hand on her arm, not a gentle guiding touch, but a grip, fingers closing around her wrist with clear intent to stop her movement. Ruth felt the shock of it go through her entire body. Not fear, shock. The specific shock of being physically constrained by another person when you are 74 years old and have done nothing to invite it. Mrs. Calloway, his voice had dropped below the professional register entirely. I would think carefully before you bring a lawyer into this. The tax assessment is entirely legal. Your property sits in a development corridor, and the county has options about how aggressively it pursues delinquent obligations. The lawyer route makes this adversarial. You do not want this to become adversarial. Ruth looked down at his hand on her wrist. She looked up at his face. She saw in him the exact same thing she had seen in a certain category of hospital administrator over the years, the men who had never once been told no by someone they believed had less power than them. Take your hand off me, Ruth said. He released her, slowly with a slight smile as if the release were a favor he was granting. Ruth walked out of the office through the waiting room and out into the pale October sunlight. She made it to Ellie's car before the shaking in her hands began, and she sat there in the passenger seat and breathed through it in the deliberate way she had breathed through hard things for 50 years, until her hands were steady again and the heat behind her eyes had receded. Ellie came out 3 minutes later, having waited in the car per Ruth's instructions. She took one look at Ruth's face and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. She started the car and pulled out of the parking lot and drove in silence for 2 full miles before Ruth spoke. He put his hand on me, Ruth said. Ellie's hands tightened on the wheel. What do you mean, put his hand on you? He gripped my wrist. When I said I was going to consult a lawyer, he gripped my wrist and told me I did not want this to become adversarial. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and heat in it. Ellie drove. Ruth watched the hills. I need to show you something, Ruth said finally. She pulled back the sleeve of her cardigan on her left wrist. The skin there was pale and thin, the way skin gets in your 70s, showing every vein, and across the inside of the wrist, livid and unmistakable, were 4 oval bruises, each one the precise size and shape of a human fingertip. Ellie pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder. She stopped and looked at Ruth's wrist in silence for a long moment. "How many times has this happened?" Ellie asked. Her voice was very controlled. "This is the first time he touched me. The other encounters were verbal." "Other encounters. Ruth, how long has this been going on?" "Since August. They started with a letter. Then Derek came to the house in September. He was polite that time. He had brochures for what the resort would look like. Then in October, he came again with the Deputy Brandt, the one who works directly under Sheriff Henderson, and that time there was no pretense. Brandt told me that a woman living alone on an isolated property could experience all kinds of difficulties. Those were his exact words." Ellie was quiet for a moment that stretched. "Brandt, as in Kyle Brandt?" "Yes." "Ruth, Kyle Brandt is not just a deputy. He is Ray Foster's second cousin. He has been on that family's payroll for 20 years in one form or another." "I know that now. I didn't know it in September." Ellie looked at Ruth's wrist again. Then she looked out through the windshield at the road ahead, and Ruth recognized the expression on her friend's face, because she had seen it before on the faces of people who had just understood the full dimensions of something they had hoped was smaller. "There is a man," Ellie said carefully, "a man who might be able to help in ways that the attorney and the sheriff and the county board cannot." Ruth looked at her. "Wade." Ellie nodded. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a truck passed them, going the other direction, kicking up a brief swirl of dried leaves. Ruth watched them settle. "I don't want Wade involved in this," Ruth said. "I know. He has worked very hard. The garage, the terms of his parole. He has rebuilt something real, Ellie. If he comes here and does something." "I know," Ellie said again quietly. "But Ruth, look at your wrist." Ruth looked at her wrist. She looked at the 4 fingerprint bruises, and she thought about the letter on her kitchen table with the tax figure in bold print, and she thought about Kyle Brandt standing on her front porch in October with his hand resting on his service weapon in that particular way that meant it was not accidental. And she thought about the creek at the back of her property that Gerald had loved, and the oak tree in the front yard, in 38 years of mornings watching the light come through that kitchen window. She thought about Wade Calloway at 15 years old sitting on her porch steps in the rain because he had nowhere else to go. She thought about the year she and Gerald had spent fighting to become his legal guardians. She thought about the day he had walked across the stage at Calhoun High, and she had cried in a way she had not cried since her wedding day. She thought about the years after that when the road had taken him places she could not follow, and the phone calls she had taken in the middle of the night from police departments in 3 different states, and the visits to 2 different correctional facilities, and the way she had never once told him he was not worth the trouble, because he was never, not for a single day, not worth the trouble. She thought about the last time she had seen him, 8 months ago, when he had driven up from Nashville in the truck and spent 2 days fixing the fence along the back property line that she had been telling herself she would get to. He had fixed the fence and eaten her cooking and sat on the porch in the evenings talking about the garage, about the new contract with a fleet service company, about the fact that he was finally, at 45 years old, starting to understand what it meant to build something that lasted. He had hugged her goodbye at the car and said what he always said when he left. "I'm good, Mom. Don't worry about me." She had never told him. She had not told him about the letters, or Derek Foster's office visits, or Kyle Brandt on her porch. She had not told him because she was 74 years old, and she had always managed her own problems, and because she had been afraid of precisely this moment, sitting on a gravel shoulder with 4 bruises on her wrist that looked like a man's fingers. "Call him," Ruth said. She pulled down her sleeve. "But Ellie, you tell him I am asking him to come and talk. Not to do anything else. Talk." Ellie nodded. She picked up her phone and dialed. It rang 4 times. Wade Calloway picked up on the 5th ring with the slightly distracted quality of a man who was in the middle of something. In the background, Ruth could hear the metal and grease sounds of a working garage, the air compressor cycling, someone calling a part number across a concrete floor. "Ellie," he said, his voice immediately shifting to a more attentive register. "Hey, everything okay? Is Ruth all right?" Ruth closed her eyes briefly. "She's with me," Ellie said. "She's fine. But Wade, I need you to listen carefully because she is sitting right here and she's going to argue with me about how serious this is, but I need you to hear it from me first." There was a pause. The sounds from the garage quieted as if he had moved somewhere private. "She's been receiving coercive letters from the county development office. 3 assessments in 6 weeks, each one higher than the last. The goal is to make her property taxes unpayable so they can force a lien and take the land for a resort development." "How much are they trying to hit her for?" Wade's voice was quiet now. "Nearly 4 times what she paid last year." A silence. "That's not a reassessment. That's a mugging. It gets worse. Today, Derek Foster gripped her wrist when she tried to leave his office. Hard enough to bruise. And in October, Kyle Brandt came to the house. You know who Brandt is. Ray Foster's cousin. Yeah, I know him. He was in uniform, and he made remarks about a woman living alone on an isolated road." The silence on Wade's end was different this time. It had a specific quality to it. The quality of a very controlled man exercising that control with considerable effort. "Is she hurt? She has bruises on her wrist." "She is..." Ellie glanced at Ruth. "She is Ruth. She is sitting here looking like she could take on the whole county board single-handed. But Wade..." "I'm already in the truck," he said. "She says she wants you to come and talk." Not, "I heard you. I'm coming to talk." A pause. "Tell her I'll be there in 3 hours. Tell her not to open the door for anyone she doesn't know between now and then." The line went dead. Ellie set the phone on the center console. Ruth was looking out through the windshield at the road, and her jaw had the set it got when she was processing something and had not yet decided how she felt about it. "He's coming," Ellie said unnecessarily. "I know," Ruth said. "Drive me home. I need to make something for him to eat." The 3 hours passed in the particular way that waiting hours pass when you know something is going to change at the end of them. Ruth made cornbread and a pot of bean soup and tried to read and could not. She walked through the house the way she had been walking through it for 4 years since Gerald died, with the awareness of someone who understands that a space can hold history the way soil holds water slowly and deep and not easily recovered when it drains away. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom that had been Wade's for 2 years, the years between 15 and 17 when he had lived with them, and she looked at the same walls and the same window and thought about the boy who had slept in that room and the man who was now 3 hours away on a highway coming back to her. She heard the truck on the gravel at 4 in the afternoon. Wade Calloway was 6 feet and broad, with the particular solidity of a man who has done physical work his whole life, and with the bearing of someone who had learned early that the world made certain assumptions about big men with rough edges, and that you could spend your energy fighting those assumptions, or you could use them. He wore a dark green canvas jacket over a black shirt and boots that had seen considerable mileage. And when he came through the kitchen door and saw Ruth standing at the stove, something in his face shifted, in the way it always shifted when he saw her, the controlled exterior becoming briefly, unmistakably, something softer. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and put his arms around her carefully, the way he had learned to hug her after she broke her wrist 2 years ago, the way that accounted for her smaller size, and the fact that she was not as solid as she looked. "Hey, Mom," he said into the top of her head. "Wade," she said. She held on for a moment longer than she would have in front of anyone else. He pulled back and looked at her, and then without saying anything, he took her left hand and turned it over, and looked at the bruises on her wrist. His jaw tightened. His eyes went very still, which was, Ruth knew, more alarming than if they had gone hot. "Sit down," she said. "Let me get you something to eat, and you can tell me what you're thinking." "I can tell you what I'm thinking right now." "Sit down anyway." They sat at the kitchen table, Ruth and Wade and Ellie, who had stayed, and Ruth served the soup and the cornbread, and they talked. Wade listened more than he spoke, which was how he had always processed difficult information, taking it in and turning it over with the methodical patience of a mechanic diagnosing something that has gone wrong in a system he understands. He asked questions. He asked Ruth to walk him through every interaction with Derek Foster from the beginning, every word of every letter, every detail of Kyle Brandt's visit to the porch. He asked about the other properties on Mercer Road, who had already sold, who was left. Ruth told him what she knew. The Hendersons had sold in June, she had heard. The Pattersons in August. She did not know about the Weaver place at the end of the road. Everyone else is gone, Wade said, as far as I know. He was quiet for a moment, his spoon tracing a slow circle in the soup bowl. Then you're the last one. The only thing standing between them and a complete parcel. That seems to be the situation. And the tax assessment, they'll file the lien in February if you don't pay. That's what the letter says. Wade looked at the 3 envelopes on the table. He picked up the most recent one and read it carefully, front and back. He set it down. He looked at Ellie. Do you know what they're building? He asked. Resort and Conference Center, Ellie said. It's been in the planning stage for 2 years. The whole project is being backed by a development group out of Nashville. Ray Foster is the county liaison. It's worth somewhere around $40 million once it's built. And my mother's 3 acres is the keystone, Wade said. He did not say it like a question. Ruth set down her spoon. Wade, I need you to hear what I said to Ellie. I am asking you to help me find a solution that doesn't put you in a position where... I know, he said. I mean it. I did not call you here so that you could go do something that undoes the last 3 years. I know, Mom. He looked at her directly, and his voice was steady in the way that she had learned over many years meant he was telling her the truth. I'm not going to do anything stupid, I promise you. He paused. But there are things I can do that are not stupid, that are entirely legal and completely effective. And I think it's time to do them. Ruth held his gaze. She had not raised Wade Calloway. Exactly he had come to them, too old and too formed to be raised in any conventional sense. But she had known him long enough and deeply enough to understand the difference between his controlled surface and what moved underneath it. And she knew, looking at him now, that he was telling her the truth. He was not going to throw away what he had built. He was not that boy anymore. But he was also not going to let this go. And she was not sure, sitting at her kitchen table with the soup cooling and the last October light coming through the window and 4 bruises on her wrist, that she wanted him to. All right, she said. He reached across the table and covered her bruised wrist with his large, careful hand. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Outside, the oak tree dropped another leaf in the stillness of the afternoon, and on Mercer Road the last light of the day was fading toward the long Tennessee dark. There is a particular kind of power that announces itself quietly, without fanfare, without the need for raised voices or the spectacle of confrontation. Ruth had observed it in 30 years of nursing, the attending physician who walked into a room, and the room reorganized itself around them, not because of rank, but because of certainty. The certainty of a person who knows exactly what they know and exactly what they are capable of. She had seen it in Gerald in his best moments, in the quiet, absolute way he would end an argument without raising his voice. She had seen it in very few other people in 74 years. She saw it now in Wade, as he sat at her kitchen table in the fading light, turning the situation over in his mind with a patience and a precision that she recognized as something that had cost him a great deal to develop. He had not been a patient young man. He had learned patience the hard way in places she did not like to think about, and the patience he had now had the quality of something forged rather than given. He stayed the night in his old room, without either of them needing to discuss it. Ruth lay awake for an hour after she turned off her light, listening to the creak sounds from the back of the property and the occasional groan of the oak tree in the wind. And she thought about February and liens and $40 million resorts and the 4 bruises on her wrist and the fact that she had not told Wade about those bruises until Ellie did it for her. She thought about being afraid, about how fear had changed its shape over the years, from the sharp, immediate terror of emergencies to this slower, heavier thing, the fear of losing something you had built, something that held the shape of an entire life. The fear that was not about physical danger, but about erasure. The fear of waking up one morning and finding that the place where your life had weight no longer existed, had been converted into conference rooms and a resort pool and a marketing brochure that said, "Discover your Tennessee experience." She would not let that happen. She had not lasted 74 years and outlasted a corrupt hospital administration in 1994 and a flood in 2008 and Gerald's death in 2020 to be erased by a man in an expensive suit who thought grip pressure was the same as power. She had Wade. She had Ellie. She had the creek and the oak tree and 38 years of mornings. It would be enough. She had to believe it would be enough. In his old room through the wall, she could hear Wade on the phone. His voice was low and measured the way it always was when he was handling something. She could not make out the words. She did not need to. She heard the tone, and the tone said that Iron Vanguard MC was no longer going to be unaware of what was happening on Mercer Road. She turned over in the dark and closed her eyes and let herself sleep. The next morning came gray and cold, the first genuinely cold morning of the season, and Ruth made oatmeal and coffee and sat across from Wade and watched him read through everything she had accumulated over the past 3 months. The letters, her handwritten notes from her meetings with Derek Foster, the names she had written down after looking up property records at the county library: Calhoun Meridian Development, LLC, registered in Nashville 3 years ago, with Ray Foster listed as a director, alongside 3 other names she did not recognize. Wade read in silence. He had his own mug of coffee, and he was wearing the same clothes as the previous day, and his dark hair was still damp from the shower, and he looked, Ruth thought, more like himself than he had in years. Settled in his own skin in a way that the younger Wade had never quite managed. "You went to the library and looked up the LLC, he said without looking up. "I did." "When?" "September, after the second visit from Derek Foster." He looked up then. "You've been doing your own research since September, and you didn't call me." "I was managing it." "Ruth, I was managing it until I wasn't," she said. "And then Ellie called you." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved through his expression that was complicated and old. "You raised me to be independent too," he said. "I understand why you didn't call. He stopped. "I just wish you had." "I know," Ruth said. "So did I by the end." He looked back at the papers. Calhoun Meridian. Ray Foster is a director. He picked up the LLC registration she had printed and studied the other names. Davis Kruger, Brandon Oakes, Mitchell Roth. He tapped Roth's name. Mitchell Roth runs Roth Materials and Supply out of Nashville. They do concrete structural steel building materials. They supply about 60% of the major construction projects in Middle Tennessee. Ruth watched him. "You know them." "I know of Roth Materials." He set the paper down. "What I know is that every major supply chain in this region goes through a handful of choke points, Union's freight warehousing, and that certain choke points are," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "friendly to Iron Vanguard." Meaning that a project the size of what they're planning on Mercer Road doesn't move a single truckload of material without interacting with those choke points. The supply chain for something like this is not a straight line from manufacturer to job site. It runs through a lot of hands first. Ruth absorbed this. "So there is leverage." "There may be leverage," Wade said. "I don't know the full picture yet. I need to make some calls." He looked at her steadily. "But Ruth, if the leverage exists, I am going to use it. Legally. Through every legitimate channel available. I am not going to burn down their project. I am going to make them understand the cost of continuing to bully a 74-year-old woman in her own home. That's all." "That's all," Ruth repeated with a slight dryness in her voice that made him smile briefly despite himself. "Yes," he said, "that's all. I promise. He spent the morning on his phone, sitting in the truck in the driveway, and Ruth and Ellie sat in the kitchen and drank coffee, and did not discuss what he was doing because discussing it would not make it go faster, and would require them to confront how uncertain the outcome still was. Instead, they talked about Ellie's store, about the new road that the county had been promising for 3 years, about the Henderson family who had sold their property in June and moved to Knoxville, and were reportedly doing well. "Do you think they knew," Ruth asked, "the Hendersons, that it was coercion?" "I don't know," Ellie said. "Tom Henderson told me they got a fair offer. Whether he felt free to refuse it, I couldn't say. A fair offer at the right time still isn't free if the only alternative is what's been happening to me." Ellie was quiet. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." At 11:30, Wade came back inside, and his expression was different. Not solved, not finished, but clarified the way a situation clarifies when you have enough information to understand its actual shape. "I found the choke point," he said. He sat down at the table. "Mitchell Roth, Roth Materials. His primary freight carrier out of the Nashville distribution hub has a long-standing arrangement with Iron Vanguard through the Teamsters local. Every major delivery to a Roth supply contract goes through that arrangement." He folded his hands on the table. "Ray Foster knows this, or he would know it if someone made him aware that Roth's next major supply contract, the Calhoun Meridian Resort Project, runs directly through that arrangement." Ruth looked at him carefully. "And if Ray Foster were made aware of this, then Ray Foster would have a very direct understanding of what it costs concretely and financially to continue harassing the mother of an Iron Vanguard sergeant-at-arms." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Ruth could hear the creak. "Wade," she said, "I need you to understand something before you do anything." She waited until she was certain she had his full attention. "What I need is not for this to stop because they are afraid of you. What I need is for this to stop permanently with something binding, something that cannot be reversed when you drive back to Nashville and they decide to resume." "I know," he said. "That's why before I make any call to Ray Foster, we are going to the county registrar's office and filing a formal complaint documenting the coercive conduct. Date stamped on record. We are going to a private attorney today, not the one Derek Foster suggested, and we are going to put this whole situation in writing with a lawyer's name attached to it. And we are going to make sure that every letter, every bruise, every visit from Kyle Brandt is documented before I pick up that phone." Ruth looked at her son, her not son, the boy she had chosen and who had chosen her, back across 30 years and all the distance between who he had been and who he had become. "All right," she said for the second time in as many days. "Let's do that." Ellie drove them to the county registrar, then to an attorney named Patricia Gallagher in Cookeville, who had a reputation for taking on cases involving municipal overreach, and who, when Ruth and Wade walked into her office and laid out the situation, sat forward in her chair with the particular alertness of someone who recognizes a case with genuine merit and genuine stakes. Patricia Gallagher took notes for 40 minutes. She looked at the photographs Ruth had taken of her bruised wrist on the evening of the Foster encounter. She read all 3 letters. She asked Wade quiet, precise questions about the LLC structure and the relationship between the county development office and the Foster family interests. At the end, she said, "This is textbook coercive land acquisition, manufactured tax assessments, physical intimidation, abuse of police proximity. I can file a preliminary injunction this week that would freeze any lien proceedings while the underlying conduct is investigated. And I can file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding the conduct of Deputy Brandt." She paused. "But I want to be clear with you about timelines. The injunction can move quickly. The larger case will take months, possibly a year. In the meantime, they may continue to try other methods of pressure." "They will," Wade said. He said it not as a prediction, but as a statement of current knowledge. Patricia Gallagher looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Ruth. "I'll have the preliminary filings ready by Thursday," she said. They drove back to Mercer Road in the late afternoon, and Ruth sat in the passenger seat and looked at the hills going by the color nearly gone now, the trees showing their bones, and felt something that was not exactly relief and not exactly peace, but was the first thing resembling either that she had felt in 3 months. The papers were in motion, the attorney was in motion, and Wade in the seat behind her was studying his phone with the quiet, focused intensity of a man who was not done. She had not asked for this fight. She had not asked for Derek Foster or Kyle Brandt or the Calhoun Meridian Development LLC or any of the apparatus of pressure that had been arranged against a 74-year-old widow on a dirt road. But it had come for her, and she had not moved, and now she was not moving in a different way. Not the stillness of endurance, but the stillness before something breaks open. The creek ran. The oak tree stood. Ruth Calloway was still in her house, but the ground she could feel was beginning to shift. That evening Wade cooked, which he did rarely but well, standing at Ruth's stove with his sleeves rolled up and the radio going low in the background. And Ruth sat at the table and led him, which was something she did even more rarely. Ellie stayed for dinner, and the three of them ate in the comfortable, well-worn way of people who have been through something together, not talking about it directly, but feeling its presence in the room like a third guest. After Ellie left, Ruth washed the dishes, and Wade dried them, and they stood side by side at the sink, in the way they had stood 30 years ago, when he was a teenager in her house, and she had been teaching him that the ordinary rituals of domestic life, cooking, cleaning, showing up on time, maintaining a space, were not small things, but were in fact the infrastructure of a livable life. "There's something I need to tell you," Ruth said. She handed him a bowl. "Okay." "The morning I went to Foster's office, when Ellie called you." She dried her hands on the dish towel and turned to look at him. "I had already made a decision, before he grabbed my wrist. I had already decided that if the meeting didn't go the way I needed it to, I was going to call you myself." Wade looked at her. He waited. "I want you to know that. I want you to know that I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was going there to get information, and I was going to make my own decision about what came next based on what I learned." She held his gaze. "What came next was that he grabbed my arm, and Ellie saw the bruises, and she called you before I could. But I want you to know that I was going to call. I had already decided." Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he set the dish towel down on the counter and turned to face her properly. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I need you to know that I am not a victim in this story," Ruth said. "I am a woman who has been targeted, which is different. And I am not asking you to fight my battles. I am asking you to stand next to me while I fight my own." Something in Wade's expression did a complicated thing. He had the look of a man who had just been given a gift he had not expected and was not quite sure what to do with it. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I know that. I do know that, Mom." "Good." Ruth picked the dish towel back up. "Then we're agreed." They finished the dishes. Ruth made tea. They sat on the back porch in the cold dark and listened to the creek, and neither of them said very much. And both of them understood what the morning was going to bring. Wade had a phone call to make. Ruth had a decision that had already been made. And somewhere across Calhoun County, in a well-appointed office or a clean suburban kitchen, Ray Foster and his son Derek were still operating under the assumption that they had the advantage, that a 74-year-old widow on a dirt road was going to run out of options and run out of fight before they ran out of pressure. They were wrong. Ruth Calloway had been a nurse for 31 years. She had seen things that would take the floor out from under a lesser person, and she had stood on the floor and kept working. She had been a wife, a guardian, a community member, a neighbor who brought food when people were sick and showed up without being asked when something needed doing. She had buried her husband and tended his grave and kept his garden and lived in his house and missed him every single day without letting the missing become the whole of her. She had been a mother to a boy who needed a mother when the world had offered him nothing else. And that boy had become a man who was sitting next to her in the cold and the dark, listening to the creek that ran along the back of the land she intended to keep. And she was not afraid, and she was not finished, and the morning was coming. The stars came out over Tennessee the way they always did, this far from the city lights, not politely, not gradually, but all at once, like something being revealed. Ruth tilted her head back against her porch chair and looked at them and thought about Gerald, who had known the constellations and used to name them for her on nights like this. She still knew them. She had not forgotten a single one. Wade sat in silence beside her. His coffee mug was empty, and he hadn't moved to refill it, and she knew from the quality of his stillness that he was not looking at the stars, but was looking at the darkness in a different way, running calculations, following threads building the picture of the week ahead. She had watched him do this his whole adult life, the way he processed problems quietly and thoroughly until he had assembled enough certainty to move. Tomorrow, there would be calls. There would be the attorney's filings and the formal documentation in whatever Wade had determined in those long hours in the truck. There would be Derek Foster waking up in his house, not yet knowing that the situation had changed. There would be Kyle Brandt on his morning patrol route, still operating under the impression that a widow on a rural road was a manageable problem for a man with a badge and a powerful family connection. They would find out. Soon enough, they would find out. But tonight was still tonight. The creek ran. The stars held their positions in the cold November sky. And Ruth Calloway sat on the porch of her home, the home she had lived in for 38 years, the home she had no intention of leaving, the home that had absorbed the whole shape of her life, and Gerald's life, and Wade's brief formative years, and was still standing as solid as it had ever been. Because good things built on solid ground do not fall easily. And Ruth Calloway had spent 74 years building on solid ground. She was not afraid. She was ready. The call came on a Wednesday. Ruth was in the garden, harvesting the last of the late kale, her knees on the folded feed sack she used for kneeling since her replacement 3 years ago, when she heard the phone in the kitchen going off with the ringtone she had assigned to numbers she did not recognize. She was not going to answer it. She had not been answering unrecognized numbers since September, on the advice of no one except her own judgment. But something made her stand up, strip off her garden gloves, and go inside. The number on the screen was a local exchange. She answered. Mrs. Calloway. The voice was young female and careful in the way of someone who had been told to make a call they were not entirely comfortable with. This is Cindy from the Calhoun County Clerk's office. I'm calling regarding a complaint that has been filed against your property. Ruth dried her hands on the dish towel. What complaint? A pause. A welfare assessment complaint, filed with the Department of Children and Family Services. The complaint alleges irregular use of county benefit programs associated with your address. Another pause. I'm required to inform you as a courtesy, but the formal notification will be coming by certified mail within 72 hours. Ruth's hand was very steady on the phone. Who filed the complaint? I'm not able to disclose that information, ma'am. It's part of the standard process. I understand, Ruth said. Thank you for calling. She hung up and stood in her kitchen and was very still for approximately 15 seconds. Then she called Wade. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what the young woman from the clerk's office had said. There was a silence on his end that had a particular quality, not surprise, she noted. The silence of confirmation, not discovery. They're escalating, he said. That was my interpretation as well. A false welfare complaint, filed through DCFS against a 74-year-old widow with no children in the home. What they're doing is creating a paper trail of official concern about you, which gives them a pretext for county intervention in your property situation. If they can get a DCFS flag attached to your address, it becomes relevant to any legal proceeding about the lien, Ruth finished. I understand what they're doing. What I need to know is what we can do about it. I'm calling Patricia Gallagher right now. This actually helps us. Filing a false welfare complaint is a separate and specific legal violation. It gives her more to work with. A brief pause. How are you doing? I'm irritated, Ruth said, which is different from frightened. Good. She could hear something in his voice that was almost a smile. "Stay inside this morning. I'll be there by noon." He was there by 11:45. He came through the door with the particular contained energy of someone who has been making calls for hours and has found what they were looking for. And he sat at the kitchen table and laid it out. The welfare complaint had been filed by Kyle Brandt. Not in his capacity as a sheriff's deputy, he had been careful enough to file it as a private citizen through the standard online portal. But Patricia Gallagher had a contact in the DCFS regional office who had pulled the submission metadata and the IP address from which it was filed resolved to the Calhoun County Sheriff's Substation. A sheriff's department computer, a government resource used to file a private complaint against a private citizen as part of what was now a documented pattern of coercive conduct. "That's not a small mistake," Ruth said. "It's a significant one. Patricia is adding it to the AG complaint. She filed a preliminary injunction this morning. The tax lien proceedings are frozen, pending review." Wade laid his hands flat on the table. "But Ruth, they're going to know by end of day that the injunction was filed. And when they know Foster and Brandt are going to be angry and they're going to do something. People like this don't stop when they get checked. They escalate." Ruth looked at him. "What do you think they'll do?" "I don't know specifically. What I know is that Brandt has a badge in a pickup truck and a pattern of showing up at this property in ways that are difficult to prove unless someone is watching." Wade met her eyes. "I don't want you here alone. I have been alone on this property for 4 years." "I know. But 4 years ago, Kyle Brandt wasn't filing false government complaints against you from a county computer." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you, not telling you. Will you let Ellie stay here for a few days, or will you come to Nashville?" Ruth thought about it. "Ellie can stay," she said. "I am not leaving my home." The expression on his face said he had expected exactly that answer. "Okay," he said. "There's one more thing. I have a call to make this afternoon. The call I told you about. Ray Foster." He paused. "I want you to be in the room when I make it." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because this is your fight," he said. "I'm the phone call, but you should be the one who decides what happens after it." The call happened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at Ruth's kitchen table. Ellie was also present, sitting at the far end, hands folded. Wade had Ray Foster's number from his own contacts. He had looked it up 3 years ago in the context of legitimate business inquiries about county development projects and had never needed to use it until now. He dialed on speaker and set the phone on the table. Ray Foster picked up on the third ring. He was 68 years old and had been Calhoun County's chief councilman for 11 years, and his voice had the unhurried confidence of a man who had not been surprised by a phone call in a very long time. "Foster," he said. "Ray, it's Wade Calloway. Do you know who I am?" A brief pause. The kind of pause that contains recognition and the calculation of what that recognition means. "I know who you are," Ray Foster said. "Good, then this will be efficient." Wade's voice was level, conversational, entirely without heat. "I'm sitting at the kitchen table of my mother, Ruth Calloway, at 4412 Mercer Road. You may recognize the address. You've been sending a lot of mail there." Another pause. Longer. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Wade continued, "and then I'm going to tell you what happens next. And then you're going to make a decision. Are you ready?" "I'm listening," Ray said. His voice was careful now. "What I know is this. Your son Derek has been engaged in a campaign of coercive land acquisition against my mother for 3 months. He has manufactured tax assessments, 3 of them in 6 weeks, inflating her obligation to 4 times its legitimate amount, specifically to make the property untaxable on a fixed income. He physically grabbed her wrist during a meeting in his county office when she declined to sign a purchase offer. Your deputy Kyle Brandt, who is your second cousin, visited her property in uniform and made threatening remarks about a woman living alone. And this morning, a false welfare complaint was filed against her from a computer in the Calhoun County Sheriff's Substation." The silence on the other end of the line had a different quality now. Heavy, settled. All of this, Wade said, is documented, photographed, notarized, filed with an attorney, and as of this morning, the subject of a preliminary injunction freezing the lien proceedings and a complaint to the Tennessee State Attorney General's office. So understand the legal track is already in motion. That train has left the station, and I have no ability to stop it, even if I wanted to, which I don't. What do you want, Calloway? Ray Foster's voice was quiet and tight. I'm getting there. Wade picked up his coffee cup, took a deliberate sip, set it down. You know my club, Ray. You know what Iron Vanguard is and what it isn't. You know that we run legitimate operations. The garage, the freight partnerships, the supply chain arrangements. You know that Mitchell Roth's materials company has contracts with 3 separate Teamsters locals that Iron Vanguard has influence with. And you know that the Calhoun Meridian Resort project is going to need a very large amount of concrete, steel, lumber, and building materials over the next 18 months. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I'm not threatening your project, Ray. I want to be completely clear about that. I'm not in the business of threatening projects. I'm in the business of understanding relationships. And what I understand is this. A man in your position needs those supply chains to be cooperative, needs the freight to run on schedule, needs the union relationships to stay smooth. And all of it runs considerably better when the Iron Vanguard doesn't have a personal reason to make phone calls. Ruth was watching her son's face. He was absolutely calm. Not cold, not the blank cold of suppressed anger, but genuinely calm the way a man is calm when he is stating facts in which he has complete confidence. You have a choice, Wade said. Option 1, your son Derek walks into Patricia Gallagher's office and provides a full written statement acknowledging the manufactured assessments and the coercive conduct. Kyle Brandt does the same with the DCFS complaint. Both of them resign from their county positions effective immediately, and the Foster family's official involvement in the Calhoun Meridian project is restructured to remove the direct conflict of interest between the development and the county assessor's office. You issue a corrected tax assessment for 4412 Mercer Road, returning it to its accurate historical rate. You leave my mother alone. She keeps her land, her home, her life. The project proceeds without her property on the parcels you've already acquired. The legal complaint to the AG remains on file because I will not withdraw it, but it does not proceed to prosecution if this option is taken. The silence from Ray Foster was long, and option 2, his voice was barely above a murmur. Option 2 is that nothing I just described happens, in which case Patricia Gallagher's case proceeds on its current trajectory. The AG's office conducts a full investigation into county assessment practices over the last 3 years, and Iron Vanguard becomes very interested in the health of the supply chain arrangements connected to Roth Materials. Wade paused. I'll be honest with you, Ray. Option 2 costs everyone, including me. It's slow and it's expensive, and nobody wins clean. Which is why I'm giving you option 1 first. Ray Foster said nothing for a moment. Then, can I call you back? You have until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Wade said. My mother's attorney will be in her office at 9. If I haven't heard from you by then, the call goes to Patricia Gallagher instead of you. He ended the call. He set the phone on the table. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him. The kitchen was completely quiet. Ellie at the far end of the table had not moved. Outside the creek ran. The oak tree stood. Was that everything? Ruth asked. That was everything I had, Wade said. Ruth nodded slowly. Then she stood up and went to the counter and put the kettle on, because there was nothing to do now but wait, and waiting was better done with tea. They did not hear from Ray Foster that afternoon. They ate dinner. Ellie stayed sleeping in the guest room. Ruth went to bed at her usual time and slept better than she had in 3 months, which surprised her and also did not surprise her. She had made her stand. Wade had made the call. The situation was no longer accumulating against her. It had been named, and a named thing is less powerful than an unnamed one. In the morning, she was up before the others. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her hands around her mug and watched the pale, early light come through the window and thought about what would happen if Ray Foster did not call. Patricia Gallagher's case was real and had merit and would move forward regardless. The supply chain conversation was real and would have real consequences. She was not without resources, but she also knew in the honest part of herself that she had been consulting for 74 years that the legal track was slow and costly and uncertain, and that Derek Foster and Kyle Brandt, if sufficiently threatened, were capable of making the months between now and a resolution very uncomfortable for an old woman living alone on a dirt road. She was not afraid of uncomfortable, but she was aware of it. At 8:47, Wade's phone rang. He was in the kitchen by then, pouring coffee, and he answered it and listened for approximately 90 seconds without speaking. And then he said, "Yes, Thursday morning works. Patricia Gallagher's office, 421 Maple in Cookville. Derek and Kyle need to be there in person." He listened for another moment. "Yes, Ray, I understand." He ended the call. He looked at Ruth. "He's taking option one," Wade said. Ruth set down her coffee cup. Her hands were absolutely steady. "Both of them?" she asked. "Both. Derek will provide the written statement. Kyle will address the DCFS complaint. The county will issue a corrected assessment." Wade held her gaze. "It's Thursday, not today, but it's real." Ruth nodded. She looked out the window at the oak tree. A cardinal had landed on the lower branch, the one Gerald had always said was the right height for a swing, though they had never built one. "Thank you," she said. Not to Wade specifically, to the room, to the morning. "Don't thank me yet," Wade said. "Thursday is 2 days away." "I know," Ruth said, "but I'm going to sit with it until then." Ellie came into the kitchen and looked at both of their faces and understood. She poured herself coffee without a word and sat down, and the three of them drank their coffee in the early November light, and nobody said anything for a long time. And it was the most peaceful, long time Ruth had experienced in 3 months. But Thursday was still 2 days away. And Derek Foster was the kind of man who did not go quietly into accountability, and his father's promise extracted under economic pressure was a promise that would hold only if Derek understood with complete certainty that the alternative was worse. Ruth had been a nurse long enough to know that coerced behavior was not changed behavior, and that a cornered man was the most dangerous version of a man. She was right to be cautious. She found out on Thursday morning at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the meeting at Patricia Gallagher's office, when Ellie shook her awake and handed her the phone. It was Patricia Gallagher. Her voice was controlled but tight. "Mrs. Calloway, I need you to stay home this morning. Don't come to the office." Ruth sat up in bed. "What happened?" "Derek Foster went to the sheriff's substation last night. Not to Brandt, to Henderson directly. He told Henderson that your son is attempting to extort the county with threats against a legitimate development project. Henderson has filed a formal complaint with the Calhoun County DA's office." A pause. "They are trying to preempt the meeting by reframing the narrative. If they can get the DA to open an extortion inquiry against Wade before we can get the written statements in the record, the whole picture gets muddied." Ruth stood up from the bed. Her feet found the floor with the certainty of someone who has stood up in the dark in unfamiliar situations for 30 years. "How serious is the threat?" "It's real enough that I am postponing Thursday's meeting until I can speak directly with the DA's office. I need to get ahead of this before—" "Patricia." Ruth's voice was steady and clear. "I need you to tell me what you need from me right now." A brief silence. "I need you to stay home. I need Wade to stay with you. And I need about 4 hours to make some calls." "You'll have them," Ruth said. "Call me when you know something." She went to wake Wade. He was already awake. He was standing at the kitchen window in yesterday's clothes with his phone in his hand, and when Ruth told him what Patricia had said, his face went through a rapid sequence of calculations that she recognized as the preliminary to a decision. He did not swear. He did not pace. He simply stood there for a moment, and she watched him turn the new information over and find the angle on it. Henderson is Ray's man too, Wade said. That's the move. Ray promised option 1 to get me off the phone, and then Derek ran to Henderson before Ray could stop him. Or Ray let Derek run to Henderson. He lowered the phone. They're trying to flip the story. If they can get the DA looking at me for extortion, then the whole conversation I had with Ray Foster yesterday looks like a threat instead of a negotiation. Is it a threat instead of a negotiation? Wade looked at her. What do you think? Not. Ruth thought about it honestly. What you said to him was accurate. You described real capabilities that Iron Vanguard has in relation to the supply chain. You did not invent leverage that doesn't exist. You gave him a choice. Whether that constitutes a threat or a negotiation depends entirely on who tells the story first, Wade said. That's what they're counting on. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table. The morning light was coming in and the kettle was on, and the whole situation had the feeling of something that was very close to resolving, but that could still go wrong in a specific and damaging way. She thought about Derek Foster at 7 o'clock the previous evening, deciding to make a preemptive strike. She thought about the kind of decision that required the calculation of a man who knows he is cornered and decides that the best move is to try to make the cage bigger. It was not a smart move, but it was a desperate one, and desperate moves did not need to be smart to cause damage. Patricia is going to handle it. Ruth said as much to herself as to Wade. She's good, Wade agreed, but this is going to require more than paperwork this morning. He stepped away from the window and sat down across from Ruth. He was quiet for a moment looking at the table. Then he looked up. There's something I should have told you sooner, he said, about why I know what I know about the supply chain and Ray Foster and Mitchell Roth. Ruth waited. Last year, a contractor out of Knoxville tried to push a Roth material supply deal through a warehouse in Davidson County without going through proper channels. He was trying to cut out the union arrangement, which cuts out the Teamsters, which cuts out the relationship we have with that local. He paused. It became a problem. I was the one who resolved it, which means I spent about 3 months last year getting a detailed picture of exactly how the Foster-Roth partnership works, who benefits, and what it depends on. He held her gaze. When Ellie called me and told me what was happening to you, I already had most of the picture. That's why I found the choke point so quickly. Ruth absorbed this. You knew this when you came. I knew the landscape. I didn't know Foster's son was the one running the intimidation campaign. That part I didn't know until you told me. But you came to Calhoun already knowing you had leverage. Yes. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She was not angry. She was thinking about whether this changed anything, and she determined that it did not change the shape of what had happened, but it did clarify something about the chain of events that had led to this morning. Wade had not been working blind. He had known when he got in that truck that there were tools available to him. The question had always been whether to use them, and how. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because, Wade said, you had just made it very clear to me that this was your fight, and you were going to stand in it yourself. And I didn't want you to think I was taking it over. Ruth looked at her son for a long moment. Wade, she said finally, I am 74 years old. I have been managing this situation alone for 3 months. I am not fragile. You can tell me things. I know that, he said. I'm still learning. We both are, Ruth said. She pushed the coffee pot toward him. Drink your coffee. We wait for Patricia. The 4 hours were long. Ellie arrived at 8 with biscuits from the diner, and the 3 of them sat in the kitchen and ate and waited and talked about other things: Ellie's store, the road, what Ruth's nephew in Chattanooga was up to, and did not talk about what they were waiting for, which was the call that would tell them whether the last move had broken things open or closed them down. The call came at 11:48. Patricia Gallagher's voice when she spoke was not tight anymore. It had the quality of controlled satisfaction, the tone of a person who has spent 4 hours on the phone and has found what she was looking for. I spoke with the DA directly, Patricia said. James Whitmore has been the DA for this county for 9 years. He is not, it turns out, Ray Foster's man. He is his own man, which is something Derek Foster did not account for when he went to Henderson. A brief pause. When Whitmore pulled the full file, the letters, the AG complaint, the DCFS complaint filed from the county computer, the attorney report on the physical contact in Foster's office, he understood immediately what he was looking at. He told me, and I am quoting him directly, that if anyone in his county is filing extortion complaints, he intends to look very carefully at whether the person filing the complaint is the one who has actually been conducting a coercive enterprise. Ruth exhaled. Whitmore is not going to pursue the extortion complaint against Wade, Patricia continued. He is, however, going to have a conversation with Sheriff Henderson about the appropriate use of county resources for complaint filing. And he has indicated informally that the AG investigation now has his full cooperation. She paused. Ruth, we are past the crisis point. Derek made a mistake going to Henderson without fully understanding where Whitmore stood. It backfired. The Thursday meeting, Ruth asked. Still on. Derek and Kyle will be there. Ray Foster called me directly 20 minutes ago to confirm. He sounded like a man who has been awake all night and has come to understand that his son's decisions have created a situation from which there is no clean exit. A dry note in Patricia's voice. He used the phrase, moving forward constructively, 4 times. Ruth thanked her and ended the call. She relayed the substance to Wade and Ellie. Ellie set down her biscuit and pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table. That's it, she said. That's actually it. Thursday will confirm it, Wade said. But yes, I think that's it. He was watching Ruth. She was looking out the window again at the oak tree, at the sky beyond it, at the pale November light coming down through the stripped branches and landing on her yard and her garden and her small remaining piece of Gerald's grandfather's land. What are you thinking? Wade asked. I'm thinking, Ruth said slowly, about all the people who sold. The Hendersons, the Pattersons, all of them. I'm thinking about whether they sold because they wanted to or because they had no one to call. The room was quiet. I'm thinking, she continued, that what I had the reason this is resolving and not still accumulating is not because I am exceptional. It's because I had you and you had a phone and the other people on this road had neither. She turned from the window. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. No one said anything. There was nothing particularly useful to say. Ruth was right, and they all knew it, and the rightness of it had a particular weight that was different from the relief that had just filled the room. Thursday, Wade said finally. Thursday, Ruth agreed. She got up and refilled her coffee and stood at the counter looking out the window at her yard, and she let herself have the relief quietly, privately, the way she had learned to hold difficult feelings for 30 years, at a bedside, taking what the moment offered, without pretending it was more or less than it was. It was not over. Thursday was still Thursday, and coerced men in offices with lawyers present could still find ways to hedge and complicate and delay. She knew that. She had been a nurse. She knew that crises did not end cleanly. They ended in stages with residue, and you dealt with each stage as it came. But the trajectory had changed. The weight had shifted, and somewhere in Calhoun County, Derek Foster was sitting with the knowledge that his move had not worked, that the DA was not his father's man, that the story he had tried to tell had not stuck, and that Thursday was coming whether he was ready for it or not. Ruth Calloway stood at her kitchen window and watched the cardinal come back to the oak tree. Same branch as yesterday, lower one, the right height for a swing. She thought about Gerald. She thought about 38 years of mornings. She thought about what it meant to hold something so carefully for so long that it becomes indistinguishable from who you are. Thursday was coming, and she would be there, standing on solid ground. Wednesday passed quietly, which was itself a kind of gift after the preceding months. Wade drove into town in the afternoon and came back with groceries and somewhat inexplicably a 6-pack of good Tennessee craft beer, which he set in the refrigerator without comment, and which Ruth chose not to comment on either. Ellie went back to her store for the afternoon and returned in the evening. The three of them had dinner and watched something on television that none of them could have summarized afterward, and went to bed at reasonable hours, and Ruth slept again with the particular ease of someone who has stopped bracing for a blow. She dreamed about Gerald. In the dream, he was fixing the fence along the back property line, not the fence Wade had fixed 8 months ago, but the original fence, the one from the early years of their marriage, the pine posts and wire that had marked the boundary between their land and the Weaver place before the Weavers sold and moved to Knoxville. Gerald was working steadily, the way he always worked, with his shirt off in the summer heat, and a level of concentrated attention that he brought to physical tasks that he never quite managed in conversation. In the dream, Ruth was standing at the property line, watching him, and he looked up at her, and he said something that she lost before she was fully awake. Only the tone of it remaining, something warm and certain, something that sounded like he was not worried. She woke at 5 and lay still for a while in the dark, listening to the creek. Then she got up and made coffee and prepared for Thursday. Patricia Gallagher's office was at the corner of Maple and 3rd in Cookville, a 40-minute drive from Mercer Road. They arrived at 8:50. Patricia met them at the door, looking sharp and deliberate in a way that communicated readiness rather than anxiety. She shook Ruth's hand first, then Wade's. "Ray Foster is already here," Patricia said quietly. "With his attorney. Derek is here. Kyle Brandt is here without an attorney, which is telling." She looked at Wade. "Sheriff Henderson is not here and was not invited, which is also telling." They went into the conference room. Ray Foster was 68 years old and looked this morning every year of it. He had the appearance of a man who had spent the past 48 hours in negotiations with people who were telling him things he did not want to hear, which was accurate. He had silver hair and a square jaw, and the remnants of a bearing that had once conveyed authority, though at this particular moment, the authority was considerably diminished. His attorney, a compact man named Deering, sat beside him with a yellow legal pad and the careful face of someone managing a difficult situation. Derek Foster sat 2 seats down from his father. He was wearing a suit, but had the look of someone who had put it on mechanically without the normal investment in its effect. His eyes, when Ruth sat down across from him, held something she had not seen in his office 6 weeks ago. Not contrition, exactly. Something more defensive than that. The look of a man who has been told very specifically what his choices are, and who does not like any of them. Kyle Brandt was at the far end of the table. He was in civilian clothes, not his deputy's uniform, which was itself a signal. He was looking at the table. Ruth sat down. Wade sat beside her. Ellie had remained in the reception area at Patricia's suggestion. Patricia took the seat at the head of the table with a file folder in front of her, and the organized calm of someone who has had this conversation before and knows how it goes. "Thank you all for being here," Patricia said in the measured tone that Ruth recognized as professional courtesy deployed for the record. "I've prepared written statements for both Mr. Foster Jr. and Deputy Brandt. The substance of those statements has been reviewed by all parties. We are here to have them signed and notarized." She looked at Ray Foster's attorney. "Unless there are outstanding objections." Deering said there were no outstanding objections. He said it in the tone of a man delivering news he had delivered many times in the past 48 hours. Patricia slid the documents across the table. Derek Foster's hands, when they took the pages, were not entirely steady. Ruth watched him read through it or perform the reading of it. She suspected he already knew every word, and she kept her face neutral and her hands still on the table in front of her. The statement documented the manufactured assessments. It acknowledged that the tax obligation figures in all 3 letters sent to 4412 Mercer Road had been calculated to place an unsustainable burden on the current property owner and were not based on legitimate market assessments. It acknowledged that Derek Foster had used physical force, defined specifically as gripping the property owner's wrist, during the October 14th meeting at the County Development Office. It acknowledged that the stated purpose of this conduct was to coerce the sale of the property against the owner's expressed wishes. Derek picked up the pen. He held it for a moment. He did not look at Ruth. He signed. Kyle Brandt's statement was shorter. It acknowledged that the welfare complaint filed on November 3rd had been false, that it had been filed with the intent to create a government record adverse to the property owner's interests, and that it had been filed from county computer equipment at the Calhoun Sheriff's Substation. It acknowledged that the remarks made to Mrs. Ruth Calloway during the October visit to her property, specifically the remarks regarding the vulnerability of a woman living alone on an isolated road, had been intended as an implicit threat. Brandt signed his without looking up. The county assessor had submitted a corrected assessment in advance of the meeting by arrangement. Patricia slid a copy across to Ruth. The new figure was $960, essentially the historical rate adjusted for actual standard inflation. Ruth looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her purse. "The AG complaint remains on file," Patricia said. "As discussed, it will proceed to formal review. That process is outside the scope of this meeting and will proceed on its own timeline." She looked at Ray Foster. "The corrected assessment and the signed statements have been submitted to the county registrar this morning. The lien proceedings are permanently resolved." She paused. "Is there anything else that needs to be said in this room?" There was a moment of silence. Ray Foster looked at Ruth. It was the first time he had looked directly at her since she had entered the room. He was 70 years old, and he looked older than that, and she thought about what it had cost him. Not in empathy for him because she did not feel that, but as a clear accounting of the situation, what it had cost him to sit in this room and watch his son sign a statement admitting to physical intimidation of a 74-year-old woman. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was quiet and had the particular texture of a man choosing his words for a record. "I want to say that I was not aware of the conduct described in these statements. I accept that my lack of awareness does not diminish my responsibility for what occurred under the umbrella of a project I am involved in. I'm sorry for what you experienced." Ruth looked at him for a moment. She thought about the Hendersons, the Pattersons, all the people who had sold without a lawyer and without a son with a phone. "I appreciate that, Mr. Foster," she said. "I hope you'll apply that awareness to how business is conducted on the next project." It was not forgiveness. It was not warmth. It was exactly what it was, the measured, precise acknowledgement of a woman who had spent 50 years in rooms where honesty mattered more than comfort. Ray Foster nodded. He gathered himself and his attorney and his silent, defeated son, and they left the conference room. Kyle Brandt left without looking at anyone. Patricia Gallagher gathered her documents. She looked at Ruth and Wade and said, "That's done." She sat for a moment longer, not because she needed to, but because the room deserved a moment. This room had been the site of something, and she wanted to honor that with a brief stillness before she stood up and walked back into the ordinary world. She looked at the signed statements in Patricia's folder. She looked at the table where Derek Foster had sat with his unsteady hands and his ruined suit, and the specific defeated quality of a man who had been entirely certain of his own invulnerability until the moment he wasn't. She thought about the gap between who he had been in his county office 6 weeks ago, the grip on her wrist, the slight smile at the release, the practiced contempt of a man who had never been told no, and who he had been at this table 20 minutes ago, signing his name to his own accounting. She did not feel triumph exactly. She had spent too many years in rooms where outcomes were hard-won to mistake resolution for victory. Resolution meant the immediate harm was stopped. It meant the record existed. It meant that what had been done to her was documented in language that could not be unmade. That was real, and it mattered, and she was glad of it. But it was not the same as undoing. The Hendersons were still in Knoxville. The Pattersons were still wherever they were. Bernadette Locke had still sold her property for a number that reflected her desperation rather than her land's worth. Those facts lived alongside this one, and Ruth had spent enough years as a nurse to understand that holding two true things at the same time, the relief and the grief, the resolution and the residue, was not contradiction, but accuracy. She stood up. She breathed. She picked up her purse. Wade stood with her, and the two of them walked out of the conference room together, side by side, the way they had walked into it. She thought about all the versions of this walk she had taken over the years, out of hospital rooms, out of the offices of various officials who had various forms of power and various understandings of what she represented. She had always walked out. Sometimes the walkout was a defeat, sometimes a resolution, occasionally something you could call a win. This was the last kind. She tried to hold it the way you hold the good things, without gripping too hard, because gripping too hard was how you damaged what you were trying to preserve. In the lobby, Ellie was sitting with her coat folded over her arm and a magazine on the seat beside her that she had clearly not been reading. When she looked up and saw Ruth's face, she understood, and the understanding moved through her own face quickly, the relief not quite disguised as composure. She stood and handed Ruth her coat and did not say anything until they were through the glass door and out into the November air. Wade drove. The 40 minutes back to Mercer Road were quiet in the particular way that after things are quiet when the noise of the preceding hours has settled, and what remains is the true texture of the situation, neither inflated nor diminished. Ruth looked out the window at the hills, at the bare ridgelines, and the pale winter sky, and the occasional farmhouse with its lights on against the gray afternoon. And she thought about all the people living in all those houses, going about the business of their lives, unaware of what had just happened in a conference room in Cookville, or how it might eventually affect the county they lived in. Most good things work that way. They happen in specific rooms, and then their effects move outward quietly into the general body of a community, and most people never know where the change started. They just experience it downstream in a process that runs more fairly, in a safeguard that holds, in an assessment that reflects what is actually true, rather than what someone needed it to say. Ruth would probably never know most of the downstream effects. That was all right. She did not need to know them to have set them in motion. Trees were good teachers in that respect. They did not require the outcome to be certain before they put their roots down. They simply did what they were built to do, season after season, in the confidence that the ground was worth it. Ruth sat still for one more moment in the empty conference room, with the November light coming through the window and the signed statements in their folder on the table, and the corrected tax assessment in her purse. She thought about the oak tree. She thought about the creek. She thought about Gerald working the fence in her dream, and the certainty in his voice, and the thing he had said that she had lost on waking. Then she stood up. She picked up her purse. She walked out into the lobby where Ellie was waiting with her coat over her arm, and Ellie looked at her face and said quietly, Well, Ruth said, let's go home. The drive back to Calhoun was 40 minutes, and Ruth spent most of it looking out the window at the Tennessee countryside, at the bare ridge lines and the brown fields, and the occasional farm operation that had survived all the pressures and consolidations of the past decades. Still there, still running, because some things persist. She felt tired in a way she had not felt before. Not the exhaustion of defeat, but the particular tiredness that comes after prolonged vigilance, when the need to remain alert releases its grip, and the body reports everything it has been holding in suspension. She felt the 3 months of letters and worry and grinding calculation settling into her like weather. She felt 74. She also felt something she had not felt in 3 months since before the first letter came, which was the simple and available fact of her own life going on as it was supposed to go on. She thought about her garden, about the kale she had not finished harvesting before all of this began. She thought about Thanksgiving, which was 2 weeks away, and whether she had enough room in the freezer. She thought tentatively, and then less tentatively, about ordinary things, the stuff of a life that had been briefly displaced and was now in stages returning to where it belonged. Wade was driving. He had not said much since they left Patricia's office. Ruth watched his profile as he drove and thought about everything he had not said over the past 4 days, All the things he had held back out of deference to her autonomy and her stated preferences. All the things he had known and done without broadcasting, without requiring her acknowledgement of them. He had kept his promise. He had stood next to her and not in front of her. "Wade," she said. "Yeah, thank you." He glanced at her. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'm doing it anyway." She paused. "You kept your promise. You came down here and you stood next to me, and you did everything you could without doing the things that would have taken it out of my hands. That mattered to me." He was quiet for a moment. "It's different than I would have done it at 25, he said. "I know. That's what I'm thanking you for." He nodded. He looked back at the road. Something in his jaw had relaxed in a way that told her the acknowledgement had landed where she intended it. Ellie from the back seat said nothing. She had the quality of someone witnessing something private and choosing to be very still. They passed the county line. The hills came back into view, the ones Ruth saw from her own porch, and something in her chest eased further. "I need to talk to you about something," Wade said. He kept his eyes on the road. "Something that isn't about the last 4 days. Something older." Ruth waited. "I've been thinking about how to say this for about 15 years, he said, "and I still don't have the right words for it, but I'm going to say it anyway." He was quiet for a beat. "When I was 15, when I showed up at your porch that night in the rain, I had been at your neighbor's place, the Galloways, which is why my name is Calloway. You gave me the name. But the first time I ever came to your street, it was because I was looking for their son, Tommy, who owed me money." A pause. "I was not a good person at 15. You know that. You've always known that. But I don't think you know the specific thing that happened that night before I showed up on your steps." Ruth did not speak. "I had been in a fight, not the kind of fight teenagers get in. The kind of fight that adults get in when they are running with people they should not be running with. I was bleeding from a cut on my hand, and I was very cold, and I was very alone, and I was standing on Mercer Road, looking at the lights on in different houses, trying to decide which door to knock on. And I knocked on yours." He stopped. The road stretched ahead of them. "I knocked on yours," he said again, "because there was a light on in the kitchen, and I could see through the gap in the curtain. And what I could see was a woman at the table, not doing anything in particular, just sitting there with a cup of something. And she looked," he stopped again, started over. "She looked like someone who would open the door." Ruth was looking at the road ahead. Her vision was slightly less clear than it had been a moment ago. "You opened the door," Wade said, "and you looked at the cut on my hand, and you said, 'Come inside and let me look at that.' And I did. And you cleaned it and bandaged it, and you made me tea, and you asked me questions about my situation in a way that wasn't frightening. And Gerald came in from outside, and he just sat down across from me, and he didn't make me feel like a problem." He exhaled slowly. "I've never told you that it was you specifically, that it was the light in the kitchen and the way you look like someone who would open the door. I should have told you 30 years ago." The car was very quiet. The road curved through the last stretch of hills before Mercer Road. "You did tell me," Ruth said finally. Her voice was slightly rough. "Not in those words, but over 30 years you told me. In the way you showed up, in the way you called even when you were in places you shouldn't be, in the way you fixed my fence." She paused. "In the way you drove down here and stood next to me." Wade said nothing. His jaw was tight in a different way now. "I opened the door," Ruth said, "because I looked through the gap in the curtain, and I saw a boy who was very cold and very alone, and I thought someone should open the door, so I did." She looked at him. "That's all it was, Wade. It didn't require heroism. It just required someone to decide to do the obvious thing." He nodded once. He kept his eyes on the road. They turned onto Mercer Road. The gravel crunched under the tires, and the oak tree came into view through the windshield, still standing at the edge of the yard, with its bare winter branches against the pale sky. Ruth looked at it as they pulled into the drive, and she thought about Gerald planting it, and about 40 years of growth, and about the way trees put down roots, not in a single dramatic moment, but incrementally, season by season, building towards something that eventually becomes immovable. She got out of the car. She stood in her driveway in the cold November air and looked at her house and at her yard and at the road that had once been full of her neighbors and was now mostly hers. And she felt the full weight of what she had held on to and why. Then she went inside. She put the kettle on. She called her nephew in Chattanooga and told him she was fine and that she would be at Thanksgiving. She looked in the freezer and determined that she did not, in fact, have enough room for what she intended to cook, and she added a note to her shopping list. Wade sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and made phone calls, and Ellie sat with a magazine she had found on the side table and read. And the house was filled with the ordinary sounds of people occupying a space together, and outside the creek ran, and the cardinal came back to the oak tree on the lower branch. Ruth thought, this is what you hold on to. Not the holding itself, the afterward, the ordinary afternoon on the other side of the fight. She thought Gerald would have liked this afternoon. She thought, I am not done yet, not by a long ways. The 2 days between the phone call resolution and Thursday passed in the particular suspended way of time when you are waiting for something to become real. Ruth understood this kind of waiting from her nursing years, the waiting between a diagnosis and a treatment plan, when the situation has been named but has not yet been acted upon, and the knowledge of what comes next sits in you like a stone, neither good nor bad, but simply present and heavy. She did not idle. She never idled. She made her list for the week's cooking. She called her nephew in Chattanooga to let him know that the situation was resolving and that Thanksgiving was going to happen as planned. She walked the property in the thin afternoon light, all 3 acres, following the boundary lines the way she had when she and Gerald first moved in, and she was learning the dimensions of what they had taken on. The creek at the back cold and fast this time of year. The fence line along the east side, the one Wade had fixed the posts solid in the ground. The oak tree in the front yard, its bare branches against the gray sky. She walked the whole of it and stood at each corner and looked back at the house. And she thought about 38 years of the same view from different angles. The house weathering and settling and always being there. And she thought, yes, this is what I am holding. This is what has been worth holding. Ellie walked with her at a slight distance, giving her the privacy of the walk while still being present in the way that a good friend is present, not intrusive, not absent, simply there. They finished the circuit at the back porch and stood for a moment looking at the creek. I owe you something, Ruth said. You don't owe me anything, Ellie said. I owe you the phone call you made to Wade, Ruth said. I was going to make it myself. I had decided to make it, but you made it first and faster and in a way that I might have softened if I had been the one to do it. You told him the truth of it directly. She looked at Ellie. I would have made it sound more manageable than it was. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, you would have. That's not a criticism of myself, Ruth said. It's an accurate account of how I tend to handle things. I manage them as I go, and I don't like asking for help until the asking is unavoidable. I know that about you. I know you know. I'm saying it so it's said. Ruth looked at the creek. Thank you for making the call I would have softened. Thank you for telling him the wrist. You told him about the wrist, and I would not have led with the wrist. Ellie looked at her friend. You are the most independent woman I have ever known in my life, Ruth Calloway. I know. It is both your greatest strength and your most persistent difficulty. I know that too, Ruth said, and she smiled, which was the right way to end that particular conversation. And they went inside and made dinner and did not discuss it further because it had been said and heard, and that was enough. 3 weeks passed. They were ordinary weeks, the kind that accumulate without drama, filled with the repetitive, reliable texture of a life that has resumed its proper shape. Ruth harvested the rest of the kale. She put up the last of the season's vegetables, filling the shelves in the basement that Gerald had built in 1989, sealing jars with the mechanical precision of someone who has done this enough times that the muscle memory is entirely separate from conscious thought. She went to church on the 2 Sundays she attended the Methodist Church on Hendricks Road, where she had been a member for 37 years, and where Reverend Abernathy, who was 81 and had been preaching since before Ruth arrived in Calhoun, shook her hand at the door and said, "I heard you had some trouble, Ruth." And she said, "It's been handled." And he nodded in the particular way of a man who has heard all the versions of difficulty a community can produce, and has learned that handled is sometimes the only word that needs to be said. Wade drove back to Nashville the Friday after the meeting at Patricia Gallagher's office. He called every few days. He sounded each time like himself, the measured, particular version of himself that he had assembled over the past several years. The one that had the garage and the parole officer behind him and the open road in front of him. He told her about a new fleet contract, about a member of his club who was getting married in the spring and wanted to know if Ruth would come up to Nashville for the reception, which made Ruth laugh in a way she had not expected. She said she would think about it. She thought about it and said yes. She called Wade back and said yes. Patricia Gallagher filed the formal complaint with the AG's office the week after the meeting, and the AG's office opened a preliminary inquiry into county assessment practices for the period 2021 through 2024. This was slow, procedural work that would unfold over months rather than days, and Ruth was not required to do anything further with it except to be available for questions. She was available. She was always available. She had been a nurse. She understood that things that needed doing did not care about your schedule. Derek Foster submitted his resignation from the County Development Office the Monday after the meeting. No public statement was issued. The Cookeville newspaper ran a brief item noting that he was pursuing other opportunities, which was the language of a man who had been given the option of resigning rather than being fired. Kyle Brandt went on medical leave from the sheriff's department, which Patricia had told her was likely to become a permanent departure. Ray Foster remained on the county council, but was quietly removed from the Calhoun Meridian Development Project's governance structure. Mitchell Roth restructured the project's county liaison arrangements. The resort would still be built on the parcels that had already been acquired. It would be built without Ruth's land, which was the only outcome she had required. She drove past the development parcels one afternoon in December on her way back from the grocery store, and she looked at what had been her neighbor's land, the Henderson place, the Patterson place, the others, and she felt the complicated thing she expected to feel, which was not quite grief and not quite anger, but something that occupied the space between them. Those were not her feelings to have exactly. They were the Hendersons and the Pattersons and the others, and those people had made their own decisions under their own circumstances. But she was human, and she looked at the land and she felt what she felt. Then she drove on home. It was Ellie who called her on the second Friday of December with the news that changed the shape of the month. "I have a call from someone who wants to talk to you," Ellie said. "I told him I'd ask first. His name is Marcus Hogan. He's a member of Iron Vanguard." Ruth was putting away dishes. She paused. "What does he want?" "He says the club wants to come to Calhoun, to your place, to express their respect." A pause. "Ruth, I think they want to do a full ride." Ruth stood with a serving bowl in her hand and considered this. She thought about 47 men on motorcycles coming to Mercer Road. She thought about her gravel driveway and her yard and her neighbors' empty lots, and what it would look like to the people of Calhoun to see Iron Vanguard MC making a formal gesture of respect at the home of a 74-year-old widow. She thought about Wade, about how he had kept his promise, had stood next to her, had done what he could without doing what would have taken the fight out of her hands. She thought about the light in the kitchen window and a boy who was cold and alone and knocked on her door because she looked like someone who would open it. "When?" she asked. "Second Saturday of December," Ellie said. "Wade says it's the club's annual end-of-year ride. They want to make it a tribute this year." Ruth set the serving bowl down carefully. "Tell Mr. Hogan yes," she said. She called Wade that evening. He picked up on the third ring the Nashville garage sounds in the background, and she could hear from the quality of the ambient noise that he was at the end of a workday, the last of the light going. "Ellie told you he said. She did. You said yes. I did. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to, Mom. The club doesn't need. I know they don't need to, Ruth said, and I don't need them to, but I want to. Is that permitted? A low sound that might have been a laugh. Yeah, he said. That's permitted. Good, Ruth said. Tell them I'm making food. The second Saturday of December arrived clear and cold. The sky, the particular hard winter blue that Ruth associated with Tennessee, in the heart of the cold season, when the humidity drops and the air turns crystalline, and everything looks sharper than it did in any other month. Ruth had been up since 5. She had made 3 pans of cornbread and 2 large pots of chili and a pecan pie that she had been thinking about for 2 weeks. And Ellie had shown up at 8 with 2 more pies and a covered dish of something that smelled of brown sugar and sweet potato. How many is 47 people? Ellie asked, surveying the kitchen. It's 47 people, Ruth said. We'll manage. She had in fact called Reverend Abernathy, who had called 3 other church members, and by 9:30 Ruth's kitchen and front room contained 6 women of various ages, who had each brought something and who were now organizing the operation with the efficient competence of people who have catered church socials for decades. Ruth's dining table had been extended with Gerald's folding table from the basement, and the whole surface was covered in food, and the kitchen smelled like everything good and warm that a November kitchen could smell like. At 10 o'clock she heard it. They all did. It started the way Wade had described it the first time he had tried to explain to her what a club ride sounded like, not as individual engines, but as a single sound, a low collective rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, building as it approached the way thunder builds before a storm arrives. Ruth dried her hands on the dish towel and walked out onto the front porch. The women from the church followed her. Ellie came and stood beside her. From down the road, from the direction of Calhoun proper, the sound was growing, and now it had shape. And now Ruth could see them at the turn where Mercer Road curved between the 2 ridgelines. 47 motorcycles moving in formation, 2 by 2, filling the road. They were magnificent. Ruth would not have used that word before that moment. It would not have occurred to her as applying to motorcycles and men in leather. But standing on her porch, watching them come, she could think of no other word. There was a grandeur in the formation, in the deliberate collective movement, in the precision with which they maintained their lines. At the front, leading the column, was a flat black road glide that she recognized because she had seen it once before, in a photograph Wade had sent her the previous spring. The column rolled to a stop along Mercer Road and across Ruth's driveway and out onto the gravel shoulder. One by one, the engines cut out, and the sudden quiet was profound, the way silence always is when it follows a sustained sound. 47 men got off their bikes. They stood in the road and in her driveway, and they were of all ages and sizes, and the way they looked was the way any group of people looks when you see them in the context of their community, particular, individual, real. Wade came through the group and up the porch steps. He was wearing his vest, the Iron Vanguard cut, with the Sergeant-at-Arms patch, and his boots, and he looked exactly like himself, which was exactly what she had wanted him to look like. He hugged her carefully, precisely the way he always did. She held on for a moment. There's food inside, she said into his shoulder. I told them, he said, all 47 of them. They were informed. She laughed. She had not expected to laugh standing on her porch with 47 bikers in her driveway, but she did, and it felt right, and Wade was smiling when she pulled back. A man came up the porch steps behind him. He was older than Wade, probably 60, with a silver beard and an easy way of moving that suggested someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors. He had the road captain patch on his vest. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I'm Marcus Hogan. We spoke on the phone. Mr. Hogan. Ruth extended her hand, and he shook it firm and respectful. Ma'am, on behalf of Iron Vanguard, we're honored to be here. He held her gaze. Wade has told us about you for a long time, what you did for him, what you held on to, what you held off. He paused. We wanted to say that we see it. Ruth looked at him. Thank you for coming, she said. Come in and eat, all of you. What followed was the most improbable morning that Mercer Road had ever hosted. 47 members of Iron Vanguard MC moved through Ruth Calloway's house in orderly waves, filling paper plates from the tables of food, eating on the porch, and on the steps, and along the gravel driveway, talking to each other and to the women from the church in the somewhat cautious but genuine way of people from very different worlds who are trying in good faith to be in the same place. Reverend Abernathy arrived at 11. Ruth had not told him to come, but had not told him not to, and he stood on the porch talking to Marcus Hogan about road conditions in the winter, which turned out to be a topic on which they had equivalent expertise from entirely different directions. Ruth moved through her house and her yard and fed people and accepted thanks and spoke to each person who introduced themselves. And at some point in the middle of it, she understood that what she was experiencing was not the formal tribute she had anticipated, but something more organic than that. The thing that happens when community forms around a specific gravity. When people come together because something worth gathering around has occurred, and everyone present knows it. She found Wade on the porch steps near the end of the morning. He was eating a piece of pecan pie and looking out at the yard, at the oak tree at the road, and the hills beyond it. She sat down beside him. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm tired," she said. "And I'm glad you're here." He nodded. He ate his pie. They sat in the familiar, comfortable quiet of people who have enough history together that silence requires no filling. "I want to tell you something," Wade said. "Something I haven't said yet." Ruth waited. "The year I turned 17. When you and Gerald filed for guardianship and the state approved it. Do you remember what you said to me when you told me they'd approved it?" "I said you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go," Ruth said. "And if you want to stay, you can stay. You said you have a home here as long as you want one." He paused. "I want you to know that I have never in 30 years forgotten that. Not in the county jail in Memphis in 2003, not in the correctional facility in 2009, not in any of the years in between when I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be and I was doing things I shouldn't have been doing. I always knew there was a home here because you had said there was." He looked at her. "I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, knowing there's a home when you're choosing not to be in it. But I never forgot you said it, and I want you to know that." Ruth sat with this for a moment. "It's a good thing," she said. "Yeah?" "Yes," she said. "A person needs to know there is a home, even when they're not in it, especially when they're not in it." She paused. "Gerald and I told you you had a home here as long as you wanted one. That has not changed." He drove in silence for several miles after that, and Ruth let the silence run because she had learned long ago that Wade processed things in the quiet between words, that the silence was not empty, but was full of the work of a man sorting through what had been said and deciding how to hold it going forward. She had watched this process for 30 years, the characteristic way he went quiet when something had reached him. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Wade said finally. "I think about how it could have gone any other way. I could have knocked on a different door, or you could have been asleep, or looked through the window and decided not to answer." He paused. "I used to think that was luck. Now I think it's the aggregate of all the small decisions a person makes over years about who they want to be. You had made 1,000 small decisions before I knocked on that door that made you someone who opened it." Ruth looked at his profile as he drove. "I think most of the things that matter come out of accumulated small decisions rather than single dramatic moments," she said. "The dramatic moments get the credit, but it's the accumulation underneath them that makes them possible." 30 years of accumulation, Wade said. "Yes," Ruth said, "on both sides." Wade was quiet. His jaw had the tight look it got when he was holding something in, and Ruth had learned over 30 years not to press that particular moment. She let it be. Beside them, Marcus Hogan came up the porch steps and said something to Wade about the return route, and Wade answered him, and the morning was reassembling itself around the departure. The food was mostly gone. The women from the church were covering dishes and wrapping leftovers with the practiced efficiency of people who have always known that feeding a crowd is holy work. The bikers were putting on their vests and moving back toward their bikes with the unhurried ease of people at the end of something good. Ruth stood. She stood at the edge of her porch and watched 47 men mount their motorcycles in the cold December light, and she felt the profound, particular satisfaction of someone who has held a thing and been holding it for so long that the moment of release, when it comes, is not quite loss and not quite relief, but something that encompasses both. Wade was the last to go. He hugged her on the porch properly this time, both arms the way he rarely allowed himself to because he was always careful of her smaller frame. But today he held on, and she held on, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'll be at Thanksgiving," he said, "and Christmas." "I know you will," Ruth said. He went down the steps. He swung onto the road glide and kicked the stand up and started the engine, and the sound was enormous and clean in the cold air. He looked back at her once, and she raised her hand, and he pulled out of the drive. One by one, the others followed. The column reformed on Mercer Road, 47 engines, and they moved together toward the curve in the road where it bent between the ridge lines, and the sound of them built and then diminished as they went around the curve and out of sight. The sound lasted another minute, carried on the cold air, and then it was gone. Silence came back to Mercer Road. Ruth stood on her porch in the December light. The oak tree was bare and still. The creek ran muted in the cold, but running. From inside the house, she could hear Ellie and the women from the church talking as they cleaned up their voices, warm and ordinary and entirely familiar. She stood there for a long moment in the silence, in the full cold weight of it, and she thought about everything she had held. She thought about Gerald and the oak tree and 38 years of morning light through the kitchen window. She thought about a boy knocking on her door in the rain because she looked like someone who would open it. She thought about tax letters and a man's grip on her wrist and a cardinal on a lower branch and the right height for a swing. She thought about Patricia Gallagher's controlled satisfaction and Ray Foster's diminished bearing and the sound of 47 engines on a winter road in Tennessee. She thought about the people who had sold and gone, and she thought about why they had sold, and she thought about the call that she had been receiving for 3 months before she finally answered it by letting someone stand next to her. She thought about what it meant to hold something, to decide it was worth holding, to hold it anyway when the cost of holding was high, not because you were certain you could succeed, but because the thing was worth the attempt. She thought about what it meant to open the door, not just once, not just for one cold boy on a rainy night, but over and over through 30 years in every form. The opening required the phone answered at midnight, the visits made to places she did not want to visit, the faith maintained in someone who was not always making it easy to maintain faith, the door that stayed open even when the person who needed it was not walking through it. She thought about what it meant to do the obvious thing, not the heroic thing, not the exceptional thing, the obvious thing when someone needs a light on in the kitchen, and a woman who looks like she will open the door. She went inside, she picked up a dish towel, and went to help Ellie. She talked with the women from the church about nothing in particular, about the road, about the cold, about what was on television, about Reverend Abernathy's inexhaustible energy, and she listened to their voices and the ordinary sound of dishes being washed and dried and put away, and she let the day settle around her. Later that afternoon, after everyone had gone, she sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house with a cup of tea and the last piece of pecan pie, and she looked out the window at the oak tree in the fading December light, and she thought, I am 74 years old, and I have a home and a garden and a creek and a son who drives down when it matters. And I have outlasted everything that has tried to erase me. And I am going to make cornbread on Sunday, and I am going to be at Thanksgiving in 3 weeks, and I am not done yet. The cardinal came back. Lower branch, same spot, the right height for a swing. Gerald had always been right about that. She finished her pie. She washed her cup. She turned on the radio to the station that played old country on Saturday afternoons, the real old country, the kind with pedal steel and voices that knew what they were singing about. She stood at the counter for a while with the music going, her hands resting on the edge of the sink, the way she had been standing when the day began. The October light had been pale and sideways then, cutting across the linoleum in long strips. Now it was December light, colder and lower, doing the same thing it always did, coming in and landing on the floor and making the room look like a painting of itself. Ruth Calloway, 74 years old, nurse, retired, widow, tenant of this particular patch of Tennessee earth for 38 years, stood at her kitchen counter and let the music play and watched the light on the floor and felt the full, ordinary weight of her own life, which was intact and hers and was going to remain so. Outside the creek ran. The oak tree stood. Mercer Road was quiet in the winter afternoon. Some things hold because they are meant to hold. Some things hold because someone decided they were worth holding and held them anyway through the months and the letters and the grip on the wrist and the long, cold nights and the 47 motorcycles on a December road and the whole complicated business of being a person who keeps their door open. Ruth kept her door open. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The Sunday after the ride, Ruth went to church. She drove herself, which she had been doing since Gerald died, and she sat in the third pew on the left, where she had always sat, and she sang the hymns she knew by heart because she had been singing them for 50 years, and she listened to Reverend Abernathy preach about the parable of the talents, which was not his most dynamic sermon, but was one she had always found useful. After the service in the parking lot, standing in the cold December air with her coat buttoned and her purse on her arm, 3 separate people came to speak to her. Not about the situation on Mercer Road. No one was going to bring that up in a church parking lot on a Sunday morning, but about ordinary things. Dorothy Simmons, who was 80 and had been to school with Gerald's mother, wanted to know about the vegetable garden and whether Ruth was doing anything different with the kale this year because Dorothy's kale had all bolted in September. A young man whose name Ruth always forgot, he was new to the congregation, had moved to Calhoun from Nashville for work, stopped her to say that he had heard she was a nurse and his wife was expecting their first child, and would Ruth be willing to answer some questions sometime. An older couple, the Reeves, stopped to invite her to Christmas dinner. Ruth said yes to all 3 conversations. She gave Dorothy Calloway advice about kale spacing and drainage. She told the young man she would be glad to talk to his wife and gave him her phone number. She accepted the Reeves' invitation with genuine pleasure. She drove home on the empty Sunday road through the hills that were crystalline and still in the winter light, and she thought about what it meant to be known in a place. Not famous, not remarkable, just known, the specific granular knowledge of a community that understands who you are because they have watched you over time in the ordinary circumstances of an ordinary life. She had been known in Calhoun for 38 years. She had been known as Gerald's wife and as the nurse on Hendricks Road, and as the woman who brought food when people were sick, and as the woman who had fostered that boy, the Sullivan boy, the one who had turned out. And she had been known quietly as the woman who had not sold. That last one was new. It had been only a month, but it was already in the fabric of how people understood her, the way knowledge deposits itself in communities, slowly, collectively, without announcement. She had not sold. She had held on. She had had help, and she had accepted it, and she had stood on her ground. She did not know how many of her neighbors had needed help and had not had anyone to call. She thought about that. She thought about whether there was something that could be done about it, some way of making the kind of help available to people in the path of coercive development who did not have a Wade Calloway to call. She thought about Patricia Gallagher, who had been clear that her filing had added to a body of evidence that would be relevant to the AG investigation, which would be relevant to how the county conducted assessments on other properties, on other roads, in other communities like Calhoun, where people on fixed incomes lived in houses they loved and were vulnerable to exactly the kind of manufactured pressure that had been applied to her. She thought, that is something I might be able to help with. Not the legal part, but the telling people this is what it looks like part. The being available when Ellie needs to call part. She was 74 years old. She had time and she had presence. And she had the particular authority of someone who had been through the specific thing and had come out the other side with her land and her dignity intact. She would think about it more in January when things had settled. For now, she needed to decide about the kale spacing for next spring. Practical things. The practical things were what held a life together between the moments of significance. And Ruth had learned over 74 years to take her practical things seriously. She pulled into the driveway on Mercer Road. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, looking at the house, her house, Gerald's house, the house she was going to keep in the Sunday afternoon light. The oak tree's shadow fell across the front yard in the particular long angle of winter light. She got out of the car. She went inside. She put on the kettle. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the cardinal on the lower branch of the oak tree. And she thought about Gerald saying, the right height for a swing. And she thought, maybe next spring I'll put up a swing. Maybe next spring. She had time. The kettle began to whistle. Ruth turned from the window and tended to it. And the house was warm, and the light was good. And outside on Mercer Road, the December afternoon was still and cold, and entirely her own. Wade called on Sunday evening, as he had taken to doing. She picked up on the second ring. How was church? He asked. Abernathy preached the talents parable. Dorothy Simmons had questions about kale. The Reeves invited me for Christmas dinner. Are you going? Yes. Are you coming back for Christmas? I told you I was. Then we'll go to the Reeves and then come home and I'll make something here. Is there anything you want? A brief pause. She could hear Nashville in the background, the comfortable, ambient sound of a city on a Sunday evening. Whatever you make, he said. That's not an answer. I know. It's the only one I've got. She shook her head the way she had been shaking her head at his particular evasions for 30 years. I'll make the pecan pie again, she said, since you ate most of the last one. I ate one piece. You ate 3 pieces. I counted. A sound that was definitively a laugh this time. How are you doing? He asked. The shift from banter to the genuine question was seamless, the way it was with people who have practiced being honest with each other over a long time. I'm well, Ruth said. She thought about how to be more precise than that because she had been a nurse for 31 years, and she had learned that I'm well covered a great deal of territory, some of it not actually well. I'm tired in a way I wasn't before this started. Not sick tired, just, she thought about the word, resolved tired, like something has finished. Is that bad? No, she said. It's accurate. She paused. I've been thinking about the people who sold, the Hendersons and the others, thinking about whether there's something I could do. Not legally, Patricia has that covered, but something in terms of being available, being someone who could be called. Wade was quiet for a moment. I think you should talk to Patricia about that. She'd know where it fits into what she's building. That's what I was thinking. You already know what you want to do. You're telling me so, I'll confirm it. Ruth smiled. Possibly. Do it, he said. You'll be good at it. You have been good at it. She thought about that for a moment. Yes, she said. I suppose I have. They talked for another 20 minutes about the fleet contract in Nashville, about the ride about Marcus Hogan's son, who had just gotten his first job, about nothing of particular importance and everything of actual importance, the way conversations go when they are the kind of conversation that exists to maintain a connection rather than to convey specific information. After she hung up, Ruth sat for a while in the quiet house with the radio going low in the background and the December dark outside the windows, and she thought about the shape of the coming months. January and the AG investigation moving forward. February and the corrected tax assessment, her first since the whole thing began, back to $960 that she could pay without difficulty. Spring and the garden, and whatever Patricia needed from her in terms of the testimony. And throughout all of it, Mercer Road, her creek, her oak tree, the morning light through the kitchen window doing what it had always done, coming in sideways and landing on the floor in long, pale strips that she had been watching for 38 years and intended to watch for however many years remained. She was 74 years old. She was not made of permanent material. She knew what she had seen in 30 years of nursing, how bodies aged and diminished and eventually finished. She was not sentimental about it. She was realistic, which was, she had always thought, the more respectful position to take toward the facts of a life. But she was not finished. That was the fact she wanted to hold close tonight, in the warm kitchen with the radio going and the creek running outside and the oak tree standing in the dark. She was not finished. She had Gerald's house and her garden and her church and her neighbors, the new neighbors she hadn't met yet, the people who would come after the Hendersons and the Pattersons, new families on Mercer Road, building their own version of what she and Gerald had built. And she had Ellie, and she had Wade, and she had her own particular kind of stubborn, practical, open door, light in the kitchen presence in this community that was not exceptional, but was real and was hers. She had the cardinal on the lower branch. She had the right height for a swing. Some people, she thought, hold on to things because they are afraid to let go. And some people hold on because the thing is genuinely worth holding and they know the difference. She had always known the difference. She had never been afraid of release when release was right, and she had never pretended a thing was worth holding when it wasn't. But she had also never, not once in 74 years, let go of something that was worth holding simply because the holding was hard. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not courage exactly, not stubbornness, though there was stubbornness in it, just the clear-eyed knowledge of what mattered, combined with the willingness to keep showing up for it. Show up, open the door, keep the light on, hold on to the things worth holding. She had done that. She would keep doing it. And someday when she could no longer do it, she hoped that the people she had let in through her open door would do it for each other, would carry it forward in the particular way that the things a person does for others carry forward, quietly and without announcement, season after season, rooting deeper. Ruth Calloway turned off the radio. She washed her teacup and set it on the drying rack. She turned off the kitchen light and went down the hall to bed. Outside on Mercer Road, the December night was still and cold and full of stars. The oak tree Gerald had planted in 1986 stood in the dark with its bare winter branches reaching up toward them. The creek ran along the back property line, soft in the cold, steady as it had always been. The house was dark and warm and present, the way houses are when they have been genuinely inhabited, when the walls have absorbed the particular frequency of a life lived with intention. Ruth slept. The stars held their positions. The creek ran on. In the morning, the light would come in through the kitchen window, the way it always did, sideways and pale, and full of the particular quality of Mercer Road in winter, and Ruth Calloway would be there to watch it, as she had always been, as she intended to remain. The new year came in cold and clear. Ruth made black-eyed peas on New Year's Day, as she had every year since she married Gerald, because his mother had always made them, and she had adopted the tradition, and now it was hers as surely as anything could be hers. She made them for two herself and Ellie, who came over in the afternoon with her son from Knoxville, who was visiting for the holiday, a compact, quiet man named Thomas, who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and who ate 2 bowls of black-eyed peas without prompting, and thanked Ruth in the particular way of a man who was not performing gratitude, but expressing it. Wade called at noon. He was spending the holiday in Nashville with some members of his club. A quiet gathering, he said, nothing notable, but he called because he always called on New Year's Day, had for the past 4 years, and the fact that he always called was itself a form of the answer to a question she had stopped needing to ask. "Tell me something good," he said when she picked up. "I put in a call to Patricia on Friday," Ruth said, "about the availability question. She said she'd been thinking along the same lines. She's putting together a list of properties in the county that have received unusual assessment activity in the past 3 years. She wants to contact the owners and document the pattern." A pause. She asked if I would be willing to speak to some of them directly, people who might be in the same situation I was in. And I said yes. Good, Wade said. She also said the AG's preliminary findings are strong. The pattern of assessments correlates very directly with the Calhoun Meridian parcel acquisition timeline. Derek wasn't the only county employee involved in manufacturing them. Ruth paused. It was more systematic than even Patricia initially believed. Wade was quiet for a moment. How many properties? 11, potentially, going back 3 years. The quiet on his end had a particular quality that she recognized as the controlled version of something larger. You were not the only one, he said. No, Ruth said. I was the last one and the one who pushed back. But I was not the only one. She held the phone. That's part of why I said yes to Patricia. Because being available to tell people what happened to me and what can be done about it, that's not charity. That's just doing what's obvious when someone needs someone who's been through the specific thing. Opening the door, Wade said. Yes, Ruth said. Opening the door. They said goodbye, and she hung up and went back to her black-eyed peas and her guests in her warm kitchen in the first afternoon of the new year, which was no different from any other afternoon, except in the particular way that the first afternoon of a new year is different. The sense of a calendar turning, of a story continuing, of everything that was still possible stretching forward into the undetermined future. She was 74 years old. She had her land, her home, her creek, and her oak tree. She had her community and her purpose and her open door. She had Wade. She had, she thought, looking out the kitchen window at the winter yard, and the bare oak tree, and the sky beyond it, a very great deal. The cardinal was back on the lower branch, the right height for a swing. This spring, she decided, definitely this spring. January moved through its weeks the way January does in Tennessee, cold and gray, and occasionally brilliant with the hills going from brown to the particular blue-gray of winter dormancy, and the sky alternating between the hard, clear blue of cold fronts and the flat white of overcast days that might or might not bring weather. Ruth kept to her routines, which were the scaffold of her days, and had been since Gerald died. Up early coffee, the kitchen window, whatever the morning held, church on Sundays, Ellie for dinner twice a week, sometimes more, Patricia Gallagher's calls, which came every 10 days or so, with updates on the investigation and requests for Ruth's memory of specific dates and specific conversations, that she provided with the precise, organized recall of a woman who had spent 30 years keeping medical records. She spoke in late January to a woman named Bernadette Locke, who lived on a county road outside Allgood, who had received 4 manufactured assessments over 18 months before selling her family's property in October. Patricia had contacted her as part of the pattern documentation. Bernadette was 68 and had a sharp, damaged quality of someone who had gone through something and had not yet found the language for what it was. Ruth talked to her on the phone for 45 minutes, and she told Bernadette about the letters and the meetings and the grip on her wrist and the call to Wade and the attorney and the morning when it had resolved. She did not tell it as a triumphant story. She told it as a practical account of what had been available to her and what had made the difference, and where Bernadette might look even now for the documentation that would make her part of the pattern. Bernadette said at the end, "I didn't know I could have fought it." "I didn't know either," Ruth said. "Not at first. You learn as you go." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table and felt the familiar complicated weight of the Hendersons and the Pattersons and the 11 properties on Patricia's list. She felt it, and she did not look away from it, because looking away had never been her practice with difficult things. You named them, and you felt their weight, and you kept working. She called Patricia and gave her Bernadette Locke's contact information and her own assessment of Bernadette's situation, which was the assessment of a woman who had spent 30 years evaluating people in distress and knew what she was looking at. Patricia said, "You're very good at this." Ruth said, "I've had practice." In February, the corrected tax assessment arrived. $960. Ruth wrote the check and mailed it the same day and filed the receipt carefully in the folder she had labeled Property Resolved. She had been keeping the folder since August. It was substantial. She would keep it for as long as Patricia said it might be relevant to the AG investigation. And then she would probably keep it longer because she had learned that the relevant period for documents was always longer than you initially assumed. The AG's preliminary report was released in mid-February. Ruth read it on the Cookeville newspaper's website on Ellie's laptop because Ruth did not have a laptop and had never seen the need. The report documented a pattern of coordinated, manufactured assessments in conjunction with the Calhoun Meridian Development acquisition, involving the County Development Office, the County Assessor's Office, and at least 2 members of the Sheriff's Department. It named Derek Foster and Kyle Brandt specifically, along with 2 Assessor's Office employees Ruth had never heard of. It recommended referral to the State Prosecution Office for further review. It also recommended legislative review of county assessment procedures to require independent verification of assessments that deviate by more than 15% from historical baseline. Ruth read that last part twice. That was the change. Not just the individual accountability of Derek Foster and Kyle Brandt, though that mattered. The systemic change, the procedural safeguard that would make it harder for the next Derek Foster to do what this one had done. That was the thing that would outlast her involvement and persist forward into circumstances she would never know about. She thought about the Hendersons and the Pattersons and Bernadette Locke and the 8 other properties on the list. And she thought, maybe this is why it had to be me. Not because I was exceptional, because I was the last one. And the last one is the one who can still push back. And the pushback compounds. She forwarded the article to Wade with no message, and he replied 10 minutes later with a single word. Good, she agreed. It was good. It was not everything, but it was good. And she had learned over 74 years that good was worth receiving without the caveat of not everything. You took good when it arrived. You said, yes, this is good. And then you kept working. March came, and with it, the first real hints of spring, the snowdrops Ruth had planted decades ago along the front walkway, coming up with their particular fragile determination. The creek running higher with the snowmelt from the ridges. The oak tree putting out the first small indicators of bud. Ruth had been watching this tree come out of dormancy for 38 springs, and it never failed to feel slightly miraculous the way green appears on bare wood in the particular sequence of emergence, tiny and certain. She called the lumber yard in Cookeville and ordered the materials for a porch swing. Not elaborate, 2 pieces of main seat armrests, a frame for hanging. She had looked up the weight requirements in the hardware and the exact dimensions that would suit the lower branch of the oak tree, and she had determined that she could hang it herself if she could get someone to hold the ladder, which Ellie agreed to do on a Saturday in early April. She was not Gerald's level of carpenter. She had never pretended to be. But she had spent 30 years watching him work, and she had the patience for it, and she had the tools he had left her, and she was going to put up the swing. On a Saturday in the 3rd week of March, she called Wade. I need to tell you something, she said when he picked up. Okay. I've been thinking about what you said. In the car on the way home from Patricia's office. About the light in the kitchen and the night you knocked on the door. She paused. I want you to know something about that night. All right. I was not at that particular moment in a state of particular generosity. Gerald and I had had an argument that afternoon, not a serious one, but the kind that leaves a residue. And I was sitting at the kitchen table because I had not been able to sleep, and I was feeling sorry for myself in the small way that one does at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She paused. And then someone knocked on the door, and I opened it, and there was a boy who needed a bandage and tea and a place to sit. I know, Wade said. You told me once before about the argument. Did I? Years ago. You said it's a good thing you knocked on the door when you did, because I was in a very uncharitable mood, and having to help someone else snap me out of it. A pause. You said it like it was a joke, but you meant it. Ruth considered this. Yes, she said, I meant it. She looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree where the first leaves were beginning to unfurl in the March light. The thing I want you to know is that you were not the only one helped by that knock on the door. That's what I've been thinking about. It goes both ways. The opening of the door is not a one-directional gift. Wade was quiet for a moment. You're telling me that I helped you. I'm telling you that we helped each other, Ruth said, which is different from charity. It's what community is. Nobody is only the giver. Nobody is only the one who receives. The line was quiet for a moment. She could hear Nashville, the easy, ambient sound of it. Mom, Wade said. His voice had something in it that she had rarely heard, a kind of open quality, unguarded. Yes. Thank you. For all of it. For all 30 years of it. Thank you, Ruth said, for knocking on the door. They stayed on the line for a moment without speaking, which was a thing they did sometimes, and which was its own kind of conversation. Then Wade said he'd be down in 2 weeks, if that worked. Ruth said it worked. She said she'd have the materials for the swing ready, and he could help her hang it, since she was going to need someone taller than Ellie for the actual hanging part. He said he'd be there. She hung up. She stood at her kitchen window in the March light, looking at the oak tree with its first tentative leaves catching the early spring sun, and she felt the full measure of her life. The whole accumulated weight and grace of it settle around her with a particular quality of something that has found its right position after a long search. The light came in through the kitchen window. The creek ran. The oak tree stood. Some things hold because they are built to hold from good materials and with care. Some things hold because someone decided they were worth holding and held them anyway through everything until the holding itself became the structure, the invisible scaffolding of a life that others could lean against without knowing it was there. Ruth Calloway had spent 74 years building that structure, one ordinary morning at a time, one door opened at a time, one person helped at a time, one piece of ground held at a time. She was not finished. She was just getting started on the swing.